America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker with the Job Creators Network. Well, good news on the economics front. The United States has just posted its largest improvement in economic freedom in more than 2 decades, according to the newly released 2026 Index of Economic Freedom. Joining us now to break down what's driving the rebound, how America compares globally, and what it means for growth going forward is E.J. Antoni, Chief Economist at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome back to the show, E.J.
Elaine, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I am very excited to see some good news coming out of the economy. It's been very interesting following the jobs report last week. So tell us about the report. What are the biggest takeaways that you really feel like we need to focus on?
I'd be happy to, Elaine. One of the things that that a lot of people forget is that economic freedom, when people are free to actually create economic growth, that is when you get the necessary conditions to have that economic growth. That's when you get, that's how you get medical cures, for example, for illnesses. That's how you get technological advancement. That's how you get wage growth, et cetera. And so we look at those different requirements, and a lot of those requirements have to do with, believe it or not, just government simply getting out of the way. Yes, there are times, especially in the case of the judiciary, where you need a more active government to ensure property rights, for example. But so much of the Index for Economic Freedom actually centers around how well does government just simply allow people the freedom to thrive. And one of the key components of that, you asked about takeaways. One of the key takeaways in this report is the role that regulation, government regulatory overreach specifically, plays in terms of people's lives. And what we have found routinely, just time after time, year after year, Elaine, has been that you don't see the kind of human flourishing in societies with government regulatory overreach that you do in societies where government has a much more reasonable level of regulation. And so as the U.S., for example, has really improved in terms of government regulation over the last year, a stark reversal to what we had for the previous 5 years, with a lighter regulatory touch and more efficient regulation, not just simply burdensome regulation, the U.S. has significantly improved in the rankings, as you said, a big jump and a stark reversal of the previous years. And this, by the way, is one of the things that's dragging down our neighbor to the north, Canada. Why are they, although they're higher than the U.S. right now in the rankings, why are they expected to fall below the U.S.? It's not just because the U.S. is expected to keep improving, but Canada is expected to keep declining. Because as their regulatory overreach gets worse and worse and worse, especially regarding environmental regulations there, which don't actually protect the environment, but do impose additional costs, particularly on small business, that environmental regulatory overreach is going to continue to degrade their ranking, and it's going to continue to impose costs. And all of those have real world consequences, namely lower standard of living, again, higher cost of living, and slower economic growth in the long run.
Well, I mean, I really do think the regulatory side of things is always the untold story. And I think that the Trump administration and Donald Trump has always gotten that and understood the impact of regulations. It's almost like it's been low-hanging fruit for them. It was what they tackled, so aggressively in the first term and even more aggressively in this term. I mean, the Biden administration added $2 trillion worth of regulations to our economy during that term. And I mean, would you see it? I know it's not easy, but would you see it as sort of the low-hanging fruit for the administration?
Elaine, that's a great question, and a great way to put it, by the way, low hanging fruit. I think that's very, very true, specifically because so much of what we see in terms of regulatory overreach for really the last several decades, ever since Reagan, I would say, so much of that regulatory overreach is a result of essentially Congress deferring to the executive branch, which with now some recent Supreme Court decisions have really turned that on its head, I think. But whatever the case, the reason that's so important is because it turns deregulation into the low-hanging fruit that I think you're describing. In other words, these are things that the executive can act on their own versus needing to act on with Congress. For example, to really cut government spending, the executive is pretty limited in what they can do. Now, Trump has been throwing the executive order kitchen sink at trying to cut spending. So he deserves kudos for that. Look, the Trump administration has a lot of faults, but they've been doing what they can on the spending side, I think, in my opinion, at least. Now, to really do the heavy lifting, though, on cutting government spending, now they just need Congress to get on board. And unfortunately, I'm not trying to get too political here, but you have the Democrats who want to see Trump fail, and you have the big spending Republicans who want to see any spending cuts fail. So the Trump administration, I think, really has they're facing an uphill battle. Okay, when it comes to trying to cut spending in any kind of meaningful way, but when you're talking about regulation, again, this is something which the executive largely has control over. And so the executive can largely, therefore, act alone. Now, you can have these things tied up in courts. People can challenge what the executive branch is doing. They can challenge the rulemaking process when it comes to regulation. But at the end of the day, again, this, especially now with the overturning of Chevron in the, I believe it was the Raimondo decision, right? You now have a real reversal of that deference to executive agencies, which I think will help in overturning these regulations. So much of this, Elaine, goes back to this really basic idea that when you do propose these regulations, the executive agencies are supposed to, if we can think back to our grammar school days in math class, show your work. Right? The executive branch is supposed to essentially demonstrate that they have done a cost-benefit analysis, including for small business, by the way, and that they have determined that there's going to be a net positive impact on these regulations. And so often what we saw, not just during the Biden years, but I think it really reached a kind of fever pitch during the Biden years, was executive agencies simply kind of almost nolens volens imposing whatever kind of rules they wanted without actually showing their work. And a lot of people don't know this, but there's a section at the SBA, the Small Business Administration, called the Office of Advocacy. And one of the things that they do there, and they've been doing a phenomenal job since Casey Mulligan is the head of advocacy there, phenomenal economics professor out of the University of Chicago. One of the things that the Office of Advocacy has been doing under his leadership has been going through past regulations and saying, wait a second, you guys never actually did this show your work process. In fact, there's actually something on the books. This is a legal requirement where before you're imposing these regulations, you're supposed to specifically do these cost-benefit analyses to see what is the impact on American small business, the most dynamic part of our economy. And so we've been impacting that most dynamic part of our economy with all these regulations without actually having done the work beforehand to say, is this a net good or a net bad? And again, that's been incredibly detrimental. And it doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat imposing these regulations. Trust me, I can give you plenty of examples of regulations that were put in place during George W. Bush, for example, that I think did a much more harm than good. So this is not simply left or right, Republican or Democrat. Both sides can do it, and both sides have done it. But what we have seen under the current administration, and again, this is something I think they deserve a lot of credit for. You can criticize them on other things, but they deserve a lot of credit for the massive deregulatory push which they have undergone over the last year. They got rid of a record number of burdensome regulations in just a year. I mean, that's truly phenomenal. And again, stark reversal to what we had before, where the previous administration added a record amount of regulatory costs, which you obviously already mentioned, Elaine.
Yeah, for sure. It is pretty amazing. And I was thinking about that as I was reading through this report on the regulatory side. And I thought, this is low hanging fruit. And it felt like that sort of, when you start a new job, what do you try to do? You go for the easy wins. You want to put some points on the board. Well, these are really the easiest points out there for this administration, is to go after that regulatory burden. And if I'm not mistaken, they have the White House has said that they have reduced 100 regulations for every new regulation introduced. Is that the stat I'm hearing right now?
Yeah, now I will say it's a little difficult to quantify some of these things, because what do you do with, like Elaine, you have one regulation with 59 parts, right? So, how on earth do we want to actually count these things? And you have some certain, even if you have a regulation that only has one part, but it's a relatively minor regulation, versus you have, again, a massive regulation with all these different parts. How do you compare those things? And so this is where maybe it's better to look at the overall regulatory cost. And again, in that sense, you are still way ahead, where the administration has removed far more costs than they have actually added. So, I think the math can get a little fuzzy in terms of, all right, is it a 20-to-1 ratio? Is it a 100-to-1 ratio? But whatever the case, one thing you can't argue about, again, is the cost side of things. And that's where small business, the American people broadly, but small business, I think specifically, has really been a winner. And the reason for that, as I know you're aware, and so many people in the audience are aware, is that these regulations disproportionately harm small business, because when you're a big corporation, you can afford the lobbying arm, you already have the in-house counsel, right? You can afford the additional accountants, whatever you need to basically skirt the regulation. And oftentimes, because of those lobbyists, you're able to get carve-outs in the regulation so that it doesn't even affect you in the first place. Small business doesn't have any of that. And so, again, they're the ones who are disproportionately affected by this stuff, and are therefore disproportionately helped when it goes away.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, the U.S. recorded its largest increase in this index since 2001. Is the regulatory story the biggest driver of that, or are there some other aspects of it to highlight?
Well, there's certainly other aspects of it too. Regulation isn't the only thing. I love bringing up that point, Elaine, because number one, it can be very difficult to quantify, right? It's very easy for us to quantify a tweak to the top marginal tax rate, let's say. That's something there are countless economic models on, and because you're doing it on observed economic activity, makes it a little easier for us to quantify and wrap our heads around. But so often with regulation, you're talking about economic activity that never got to happen in the first place, right? It just kind of smothered it in its crib, so to speak. And so it can be harder to really quantify that. But you're right, there are other components here to the index, and there are other ways in which the U.S. moved in the right direction last year. One of which had to do with, as it's very commonly known, the big beautiful bill. The names for these things are you got to laugh at them. But one of the components of that, not bill, now law, was full expensing for businesses. That is a real game changer. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways, it goes further than any of the kind of expensing provisions that we have had ever since businesses had to pay an income tax, going all the way back to 1913, right? So what I'm getting at here is those changes to the tax code, even though most of the quote unquote changes were really just keeping in place the existing Trump tax cut because it was going to expire. So you extended, or in some cases just made permanent, a lot of those tax cuts. But in terms of the actual additional tax cuts, things like removing, especially for folks with lower incomes, removing taxes on whole portions of their income, like overtime pay, like tipped income, those are massive pro work and therefore pro growth incentives. And they're really going to help, I think, a lot of blue collar folks. That's what the math shows us. You'll have some households that see their total federal income tax liability cut in half. I mean, that's truly phenomenal. And then on the business side of things, again, going back to something like full expensing, that's a tremendous, not necessarily pro-work incentive, although I think there's an argument to be made there, but it's a pro-growth incentive because investment is where you get that's the real long-term driver of economic growth, right? Specifically, non-residential fixed investment is what we economists like to call it. So don't include housing and don't include inventory, for example, because just because you stock up on a bunch of inventory that's simply going to get resold, right? Now that inventory is gone. That's not part of a long-run driver of economic growth. Economic growth comes from technological advancement. It comes from productivity increases. So where do those types of things come from? They come from capital, physical capital, and also things that you can do to increase human capital. So those are the kinds of investments you think of: software, factories. It could even be something as simple as power tools. Instead of a factory worker having to assemble a car using hand tools on the line, now he gets to use power tools. So instead of a handheld wrench, he's got a pneumatic wrench, right? Or it could be electric, whatever the case may be. The point is he can do the work faster. He can do the work better. He's more efficient. And because he's more productive, now he can command a higher wage. So this is where you get increased productivity, increased output, and increased wages. You get faster wage growth out of all this. That's the recipe for economic growth. And again, like we said earlier, economic growth is where you get higher standard of living, lower cost of living. So it's so important. And I think it can't be oversold, the kind of impact you have from that increased investment. In fact, we're already seeing it, right? If you look at the productivity numbers, they came in very, very good, much better than we were originally expecting last year. And now I think you're likely going to continue to see that productivity growth. Hopefully, if we can get the whole situation with Iran figured out, that's been a huge curveball. But if we can get that figured out, if we can wrap up this war ASAP and get our military assets out of the region and oil stabilizes and liquefied natural gas as well, I think 2026 is still looking very, very good.
So in the recent jobs report, the two nuggets that came out of it, although it was not a good jobs report, we lost 92,000 jobs. Those two nuggets are what you just highlighted. And that is wage growth was strong and productivity was strong. And of course, AI is playing a huge role in that. And we're starting to see that with our small business owners too, in incorporating AI into their businesses and becoming more and more productive. We've seen it in corporations for a long time, and that's where you see some of those job losses. But we're even seeing corporations, big retailers that are incorporating it into the front of the house in terms of retail and customer experience. And so productivity is starting to increase more and more and more. That was what I saw as the nuggets out of that jobs report for February.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. You're definitely seeing some positive moves within the labor market, and you just highlighted them. The difficulty, I think, is that you're at this point having to just wrestle with the fact that a lot of the initial data we got, and this is the exact same thing that happened under the previous administration. This is nothing new. But the initial data that we're getting just simply isn't accurate. And you're constantly having to go back and revise those numbers down. And it's not just the month-to-month revision, but it's these big annual revisions. We got the big annual revision to the payroll number with the January report. We didn't get the household survey data on employment and unemployment until the February report because of the delays associated with the government shutdown. But still, when you go back and you put all these revisions in place, what you find is basically this whole problem of post-pandemic statistics is still with us. And this is something we've talked about before on the podcast, which is that the government is simply not able to accurately ascertain in these initial surveys how many people are employed, how many jobs there are in the economy, and they're having to go back later with these quarterly or in some cases annual census data to have a better sense of where is the economy today. And unfortunately, it turns out the economy is not in a very good place. And I think this aligns well with a lot of survey data and some also data from private payroll processing companies. ADP is one, Paychex, Paychex, which I know a lot of your listeners actually use that one. They focus specifically on small business for payroll processing needs. And the indexes out of both of those have been actually pretty poor. And so if you kind of chart this out, what you get is from when the economy initially reopened, you got this very steep rate of increase, and it has basically just leveled off, and we're now kind of tipping over. So now instead of just going from we're basically not adding any jobs, now it looks like we may be starting to lose them. And I think a lot of this is just the result of all of the changes that we've undergone in the economy between the inflation, the changes in the labor market. It's been a lot for business to swallow, right? And unfortunately, I think some of those changes are still with us. I think the Trump administration has done a lot of good in a lot of areas, but I think they've also mishandled certain things as well. There's probably a strong case to be made that the tariffs could have been done a lot better, and that I think they unnecessarily imposed additional costs on businesses. And now that it's clear following the Supreme Court decision that the tariffs are not going away, that the administration has basically a half a dozen other tariff authorities that they can use to impose all or nearly all of the same tariffs. Now that it's clear the tariffs aren't going away, one of the things we're seeing in purchasing the PMI surveys, purchasing manager indexes, is we are seeing businesses are now much more willing to pass on the cost of the tariffs. Whereas before, a lot of businesses, whether it was the importer or the wholesaler, whatever the case may be, sometimes the foreign exporter, a lot of businesses were just eating the tariff because they didn't want to lose market share and they thought it was going to be temporary. But as it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not, more of those costs are getting passed on. And that obviously is an additional danger to the economy that some folks haven't yet priced in. So again, there's been a lot of changes in this economy that have really affected small business. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Again, we get the situation in Iran wrapped up ASAP. Oil markets and LNG returns to its normal operating conditions, if you will. We get those energy prices back down, and that kind of flatlining in terms of jobs starts to pick back up again, returns to growth because of things like increased investment.
Back to the index, even with the improvement, the U.S. ranks 22nd globally. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, who's number one? Why aren't we closer to the top?
You'd be surprised to see some of these nations, and it's really not geographical. It's from Switzerland in the middle of Europe to Singapore in the Far East, right? It really runs the gamut in terms of geography here. And Singapore, I think, is a really important one to highlight because for a long time, people thought that things like economic growth and its corollary, economic freedom, people thought that these things were somehow dependent on geography, that somehow, for example, you needed a lot of natural resources. You needed to be a Saudi Arabia or an Iran or an Iraq, right? You needed these resources in order to be rich, to be productive, to have economic freedom. And it's simply not the case. Singapore is a rock in the ocean with basically no natural resources virtually of its own. And yet they've turned out to be rather prosperous. Why? Because they've been rather free. And so again, it goes back to this idea of the more economic freedom you give people, the more prosperous they're going to be. And economic freedom is not license, right? It's not that anyone can just do whatever they want, because part of this economic freedom index, again, we hinted at this earlier, is respect for property rights. And it's the state chiefly through a judiciary. It's the state enforcing property rights, which includes not just my physical property, but things like contracts. Are you in a real corrupt country like Afghanistan, where or China or Russia, where contracts just simply are not respected the way are in other parts of the world? You look at again, let's go back to geography. Look at Poland versus the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, you don't have the same kind of respect for contracts. There are many more government violations there than in a nation like Poland. And it's why Poland gets a much higher score there than a place like the Ukraine does. It has nothing to do with geography, and it has nothing to do with the war that's going on in Eastern Europe either. This has to do with, do countries follow the rule of law or do they not? Do countries overregulate or do they not? Do they have really high tax burdens or do they not?
How much does debt and deficit play a role here for the countries that are in front of us, but also for us? Because, we're running 37 trillion, 38 trillion.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, that is not really a point in our favor. Again, I think the Trump administration has done a lot of good in terms of trying to unilaterally reduce the deficit. Well, that is until we've incurred a lot of military expenses now the last couple of weeks. But that aside, I think overall the administration has probably done a good job with getting down government spending where they can. But you need Congress, right? And until Congress really gets on board and makes that concerted effort, it's going to be hard to, basically, let me put it this way, Elaine, I don't think you're going to stop with these multi-trillion-dollar deficits anytime soon. Not unless Congress gets on board with the program and actually starts making meaningful cuts. They were part of what created the problem in the first place. And again, it's both sides. This is not a Democrat-only issue. The big spending Republicans got on board with Biden's infrastructure bill, for example. That's just one of many. So it's the big spenders in Congress need to reverse course in order to get that deficit down. Otherwise, the debt's going to continue getting out of control. And the debt is one way in which you really do stifle economic freedom. Now, you may say, well, what on earth does that have to do with it? Believe it or not, it has a pretty big impact. When the government is constantly crowding out the loanable funds market, as we like to say in economics, basically they're borrowing all the money that's available to borrow. There's a lot less now that people have to borrow. And so it doesn't really make a difference. Imagine as a small business owner, you would like to expand your business. You'd like to take out a loan, let's say. It doesn't really make a difference for you if you're prohibited from doing so because the government borrowed all the money and drove up interest rates. So now you can't afford to borrow. Or let's say there is plenty of money available to borrow, but because the government's going to tax you at too high of a rate, it's unaffordable. Or the government's going to regulate. They're going to put so much red tape in the way, whether it's building permits, environmental surveys, labor regulations, you name it. The government has a whole host of different ways, right, in which they can make your expansion prohibitively expensive and thereby limit your economic freedom. Well, again, the government spending too much and crowding out that loanable funds market with excessive deficits that drive up the debt and therefore are pushing up interest rates, that is just another example of how the government can curtail your economic freedom. And it's something we really need to work on here in the US, because eventually it does get out of control. And what I mean by that is eventually you do hit a point of no return. Now, I can't say where that is. That point of no return, so to speak, has proven different for different countries in different parts of the world at different times. So there's no real line in the sand, so to speak. There's no single metric like debt to GDP or debt service to GDP. It's just been different. A lot of it has to do with psychology, not so much math. It's when do the bond vigilantes finally put their foot down and say enough is enough?
Well, the report is the 2026 Index on Economic Freedom, and it is nice to hear some good news on the economy in general and economic freedom in the U.S. EJ, why don't you tell everybody where they can find more of what you're working on and also take a look at the index?
Sure. You can find the index at the Heritage website, heritage.org. You can find some of my work there as well on the Heritage website, but the best place to find me and all the different work that I do, including daily economic analyses, is actually on the X platform, formerly Twitter, and the handle there is @RealEJ_Antoni.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all for tuning in to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode.